What if there were a single game-changing intervention that impacted nearly all of the clients we commonly see in our physical therapy clinics? What if physical were able to take advantage of this intervention to enhance the outcomes, again, of almost every single patient seen in your clinic? This presentation about breathing and how breathing is the key is just such that intervention has impacts on sports performance, not only sports performance, but how we commonly perform in daily activities, speaking, our focus and concentration at work. People who've had respiratory disease, they're experiencing respiratory disease, COPD, asthma, shortness of breath, people recovering from COVID, even COVID, post ICU, or people who are just suffering from long COVID and haven't recovered completely. What if breathing is the key? Many of our patients with balance and dizziness problems, we suspect, are also impacted by the manner in which they're breathing. Mindfulness, which is usually thought of as an intervention for anxiety and depression, what if there was a modality that we could use to enhance the outcome and the intervention such that we had a greater measure of when we were being affected? Our orthopedic patients, particularly those with chronic pain, we are finding that they as well are being impacted by their breathing and the effect it has on their peripheral pain. Concussions, post-concussions, how the brain is actually functioning is largely influenced by oxygenation in the brain, and potentially we want to address how breathing can impact that. So a common underlying pathology is hypoxia, either the brain or the peripheral muscles and organs. How can this be? So let's just start at the periphery for a second, and let's consider that the problem is how we oxygenate our peripheral muscles, how we oxygenate organs, and how we oxygenate the brain. When we're talking about sensitivity and trigger points, we see that part of the normal cascade of events, 3 steps down, is that blood flow is constricted and and person becomes hypoxic. This is just a model of what we believe goes on, but you can also create tender muscles by altering people's breathing patterns. Conversely, you can enhance and decrease the sensitivity of the muscles by improving their breathing patterns. So maybe breathing plays more of a role in how well the muscles are oxygenated than we're currently giving credit. These images on the right are PET scans of the brain from the Amen Clinic. They find that many of the abnormalities that they see, post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, in these slides are impacted by oxygenation of the brain. Of course, anxiety, depression, what does a brain look like on anxiety? It looks hypoxic and it looks quite different from a healthy brain. Many of us have been recording oxygen as people enter the clinic. We've been using our pulse oximeters, and we find that everyone entering the clinic, unless they're sick, they have fully oxygenated blood. What is it and why is it that oxygen isn't getting inside the muscle? You can clearly see using musculoskeletal ultrasound, you can see that the capillaries are not fully are not circulating blood into a trigger point, area of a hypersensitivity in the muscle. These brain scans show something similar. So how did this, why might we be missing the magic? Why might we be missing an effect that is so profound that it affects virtually all of our clients? One of the reasons I believe is as I've started studying this, is the way that we're taught about how oxygen disassociates from the blood and goes into the brain and goes into the muscle. It's called the Bohr effect. I imagine if everyone sits for a second and reflects on when they took human physiology, they will remember that they learned about the Bohr effect. They learned about it well enough to pass the test, and they went on to summarily forget about it because it wasn't taught in an applied fashion. The Bohr effect has to do with how oxygen disassociates from the red blood cell. If we just look at this graph at the bottom, what we see is that as this shifts to the right, blood becomes more acidic. This is the oxygen disassociation curve. And what we want in the blood is it to be acidic enough such that oxygen readily disassociates from the red blood cell and goes into the brain and goes into the muscle. What we're seeing when people enter their clinic and we measure their oxygen with the pulse oximeters, we're seeing how well the blood is oxygenated. But what we are not seeing is whether that blood is disassociating and going into the muscles and into the brain and organs, heart, etc. So what we have on this graph that we didn't necessarily learn to focus on is these numbers down here. This is I'm sorry, that's not true. What we didn't learn is that this is how well oxygen disassociates, and as the muscles become more, as the blood becomes more acidic, this line shifts and oxygen is more, this is how well oxygen is disassociating. And what we don't see in this graph is that in order to achieve a certain acidity in the blood, what we need to do is actually increase the carbon dioxide levels in our blood, increase the acidity of our blood. And a way we can do that very readily is by magically changing how we are breathing such that we are increasing carbon dioxide in the blood, and the oxygen more readily disassociates. What we're seeing when we're measuring oxygen saturation in the blood when people come in the clinic is we're seeing that oxygen is stuck on to the red blood cell. We're not seeing that the blood is too alkaline and the oxygen is actually stuck there and not going anywhere. Sounds rather ominous to me. So just a simple depiction of what happens in our lungs is that what we want is we want this area in our lungs. I call it the magic. This is where the magic occurs, in the bottom of our lungs. And what typically we're missing out on is this is a mixing chamber where we can adjust how much oxygen there is in our lungs, which we typically think of that we want more of. And yet, everyone walking into our clinic with all this messed up stuff going on, they're fully oxygenated, 96, 97, 98, 99%. They're fully oxygenated, and yet we suspect the hypothesis of trigger points is the model of trigger points is that trigger points are hypoxic. Why the heck can't we get oxygen into my biceps when I've got oxygen in my blood? Why are our clients with anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, post-concussion, dizziness, the full list, why are the oxygen levels off in their brain? Well, it comes down to this very mixing chamber that I'm talking about. I'll show you in some slides coming up what I'm going to just briefly describe right now. I became interested in this personally because when I run, I overbreathe. How can we overbreathe? Don't we want to breathe more? What's going to happen? I'm going to hyperventilate. I'm going to pass out. Why am I going to pass out? It's because I'm blowing off carbon dioxide. Yeah, I'm pulling in plenty of oxygen. I'm oxygenating, oxygenating, oxygenating. Why is this not good? Because as I blow off carbon dioxide, oxygen sticks on to the red blood cell, and I decrease oxygen perfusion into my brain by up to 30%. I hyperventilate and feel awful. I feel woozy. I feel different. So sometimes we confuse breathing exercises with a different feeling is necessarily being good. Hypoxia to our brain can feel different and kind of cool, but it might not be a good idea in all cases. Some cases I'm finding it is true. So I was interested in increasing my performance. So I started looking at this situation that we run into where I'm over breathing and I'm not getting the performance that I want. And we're seeing this in patients as well with chronic pain, sleep problems, dizziness, balance, all those things that we were talking about just a minute ago. So let me just share my screen again, and I'll show you. Well, before I do that, let me just say, let's emphasize though that this is a mixing chamber, and I have variables. I have the rate at which I'm breathing. Generally, what we want to do is we want to slow down our breathing rate so that we're breathing much more in the order of 6 breaths a minute rather than the 12 to 20 times a minute many of our clients are breathing. 6 times a minute. What might that do if, as we slow down our breathing, is we don't blow off as much carbon dioxide. We actually retain carbon dioxide in our lungs in this, what I'm calling the magic mixing chamber. As we retain carbon dioxide in the base of our lung, as blood circulates through our lungs, there's either going to be a net draining off of carbon dioxide into our lungs if we blow off too much carbon dioxide, reducing the CO2 in our blood, making our blood more alkaline, which actually isn't what we want. We want higher levels of CO2 in our blood to make our blood more acidic so that we get that oxygen dissociation that occurs when our carbon dioxide is elevated. And this little number here, this is the gold number that we're looking for. We're looking for this right here. Whoops. Can I go back? Yes, I can. We are looking, I want pointers, I want my pen, I want this. What we're wanting is we're wanting our PCO2, which is the amount of carbon dioxide in our blood, to be around 40 millimeters of mercury. The trick that we will be showing people is how they can actually measure this. As people are exhaling, you can measure what's called your end-tidal CO2, EtCO2, end-tidal CO2. And that mimics what we see in the blood. And if we know the amount of CO2 that people are exhaling, we know what they're retaining, the concentration that we're retaining in their lungs, and hence retain carbon dioxide in their blood, enhance the oxygen dissociation. Folks, that is truly magic. That is truly magic to have feedback on what works for the individual as far as enhancing their oxygen dissociation into the muscle and into the brain. A little bit busy of a picture here, but I'm telling you, this is pure magic to be able to control the respiration rate, how deep a breath. We want the breath to go deep down into the lungs, but we don't want these large tidal breaths where we're bringing in lots of oxygen, which comes from the atmosphere. We don't want a bunch of that going in there because that's going to dilute the carbon dioxide that's coming out of our muscles, going into our blood, and we're going to eventually get rid of. We do want to get rid of it because it's quite toxic. Carbon dioxide is toxic, but we want to keep enough to keep control of the acidity in our blood. So what is the problem with breathing, and why are we saying breathing is the key? How does it come about that people develop alterations in their, oh my gosh, I just got a knife pain in my back. I took a rapid inhale, I altered my breathing. Now, if that just happens acutely and it's a one-off kind of event, that's perfectly fine. But as things become chronic, head injuries, people with balance problems, I mean, you walk around like you're on eggshells, holding your breath. That has all sorts of impact on our blood chemistry. And the net effect is we're actually adjusting our blood chemistry such that we avoid high enough levels of carbon dioxide in our blood to get the most efficient function of our blood and oxygen disassociating into the peripheral tissues. So reduced oxygen, reduced CO2 in the blood results in poor oxygen transport. That's just the story, folks. I didn't make it up. We learned it in human physiology, but we learned it in a way that's great for testing, but not great in using this as a measure to improve function. So just looking a little bit at how we breathe, there's some real pearls that I'm personally discovering that totally blew me away when I first became aware of it. One is that we need to emphasize breathing through the nose, in through the nose, out through the nose. That's what our nose is designed for. It works far superior with breathing in through our mouth and out through our mouth. We breathe off lots of moisture and we breathe out through our mouth. And we miss out on some truly phenomenal properties that our sinuses incorporate. Inside our sinuses, we have turbinates that kind of cause eddy currents and swish the air around so that we can cleanse and purify the air with nitric oxide that's released from the palate, above the palate in the mouth. Nitric oxide is released into the air as it circulates through our sinuses. Nitric oxide is another piece of magic. It's an antiviral, antibacterial, and antifungal. And you can't buy that kind of thing. I mean, you might get an antibiotic, you might get an antiviral, you might get an antifungal that doesn't work so well, but you can't get all three, and you can't get them for free, except for from your nose. Now you get them from your peripheral blood vessels. You get nitric oxide from peripheral blood vessels as well, but you get an ample amount in your sinuses that's going to sterilize the air as it goes into your lungs. Think about that for a minute, folks. Sterilizing the air as it enters your nose and entering into your lungs. That's golden. You can enhance this is the craziest thing in the world. You can actually enhance that effect by humming. On the exhale with your lips closed, I'm going to demonstrate with my lips closed. I'm going to hum. Breathe in through my nose, breathe out. I'm not going to do this in public. But if you do that, I got to rub my lip because the vibration tingles a little bit. But it's also vibrating my upper palate, enhancing the release of nitric oxide from my upper palate into my sinuses 10 to 15 times. 10 to 15 times by walking around and on the exhale humming. I actually hum every day on the way home from work. Yes, I'm wearing an N95 mask. Yes, I have a face shield. But you know what? I also got free antiviral in my sinuses, and I can hum on the way home and hopefully affect being able to sterilize the air. And how do we know this? Well, during the SARS epidemic, this was actually of great interest. And there is actually a study done finding that SARS is killed by the presence of nitric oxide. And there are several human studies where they've shown that humming on the exhale with your mouth closed, humming through your nose, odd, humming through your nose, but doing that, then breathing that nitric oxide in that's released kills SARS. Hopefully it kills COVID too. Probably it does, because nitric oxide is a kick-ass kind of antiviral, very powerful. One way we know this is they found a bunch of volunteers, or how good it can work is they found a bunch of volunteers for volunteered to have influenza squirted up their nose. And, you know, I don't know where they find people to do this, but the researchers do entice probably college students to volunteer to have influenza squirted up their nose. If you've got nothing else to do, why not? So they squirted influenza up people's noses. They taught them how to breathe, hum on the exhale, and they were able to prevent influenza infections. Prevent influenza infections by humming with your mouth closed. Again, truly magic. Truly, truly, truly magic. Would I guarantee that this is going to happen with COVID? Absolutely not. But also, nitric oxide, as it enters into your lungs, it's a very powerful vasodilator. That's actually how we're controlling our blood pressure. A key component of how we're controlling our blood pressure throughout our body is, as I said, nitric oxide is also released in the periphery from our capillaries, blood vessels, and is dilating and allowing blood vessels to constrict throughout our body at all times. And that's part of a large way in which we control our blood pressure. When we inhale nitric oxide into our lungs, it actually dilates our alveoli, opening up our lungs, making that exchange of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, much easier with expanded alveoli. So this is all very exciting stuff. So breathing in through our nose, just to review the anatomy, we sterilize, warm, and moisturize the air as it enters our lungs, hopefully saturated with nitric oxide. This magic, again, happens in our alveoli as we learn to control our respiration rate, the amount of oxygen we breathe out, the amount of carbon dioxide we retain, how long we retain it. As we're holding our breath, our muscles are pushing out carbon dioxide into our blood. If we retain the carbon dioxide only in our lungs by breath holds, only so much carbon dioxide will come out of the blood, and will increase carbon dioxide in our blood, increasing the acidity of our blood, increasing the efficiency with which oxygen disassociates from the red blood cell. So understanding that gas exchange that occurs in the lungs is explained by another thing we all learned, was the Haldane effect. Basic chemistry, gosh, basic chemistry, such a cool thing, lots of times misses the magic. So I'm trying to tell you about the magic. So we did discuss the Bohr effect and how, and it discusses how oxygen is disassociates from the red blood cell, and that is actually dependent on the level of carbon dioxide. We've talked about that by altering our breathing, we can change the oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations in our lungs to influence the immediately. I'm talking within seconds, certainly. We can change the carbon dioxide levels in our blood, increase or improve how oxygen just associates into our brain and into our muscles. This is truly magic, and it affects patients, all pretty much invariably everyone walking through your door. So that's our basic kind of presentation on breathing is the key. And what we're bringing to physical is the tools to use to measure how your clients are breathing, how well they're, how good the mobility is in their rib cage, thorax, where they're breathing. Are they breathing into the top of their lungs? Or are they breathing into the bottom of their lungs? What's the frequency, the respiration rate? Are they breathing primarily through their nose, or are they mouth breathers? All of these things we can measure. And then on top of that, we have this really cool device that I'll show you more about that measures actually the CO2 levels that we're exhaling, so that we can get feedback directly to the patient that tells them whether they're breathing efficiently or not. So I hope that we understand, I hope everyone understands that this is what I consider just a magical intervention. And it's all about teaching patients how to effectively coordinate their breathing. Thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to sharing in later presentations just more detail about how this takes place.